I'm Weiping, and I have gone through tenure process 3 times. Every time you move, you have to go through it once. So I I could share a lot, and right now, I'm at Columbia, but I worked for 15 years at Virginia Commonwealth University, teaching in the planning program, and that's where I started, and I stayed for 15 years. And then I was at Tufts University for 5.5 years, first as a faculty and then as chair for 3 years. And before I moved to Columbia, and I've been at Columbia for 4 years now. This is the end of my 4th year. And so, now that you know how long I've been in academia, basically I never left academia. So I really value this opportunity to exchange some ideas with all of you. And I've met many of you, almost half of you, through ACSP related activities, and I'm very impressed in how early you get involved with ACSP. So maybe given that how small we have in this group, I don't necessarily need to make a formal presentation, right? So anytime you want to ask any questions, just holler. And so what I wanted to do is I looked at your questions, and I also prepared just a few slides in a way of organizing my thoughts. And I also will share my 2 sets of statements and CVs, the sections on service, a little bit with you, just to show you how actually they have changed over time, and also depending on what your institution really is looking for, right? So it doesn't mean that every institution really looks for the same thing. In fact, oftentimes they look for very different things. Of course, we do a coherent set of activities, but it is important also to look at what institutions really are looking for. So you'll see actually my service statement got shorter the longer I served, because, Columbia was looking for somewhat different things. And also the Columbia statement was quite different, because one of your questions is saying, should I talk about future plans for service, right? The Columbia statement really looked for future ideas and didn't really want you to focus on what you have done. So it actually kind of got shorter. Anyway, so with that little opening, let me just share the screen and share this few slides. And I shared the slides with Ivis, so you could just kind of download it from the drive you already have. But am I not seeing the? Okay, let me see. Share. Okay. You can see the PPT now, right? I hope.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, I'm preaching to the choir, right? So all of you are so involved with services. I'm thinking to really think about this is also how you frame your service. And just like your research statement, you'll want to have a narrative, what you're in service to do, right? And also, oftentimes service in some institutions are not that important, quote unquote, or not as valued, but we do service because we want to, and there's also a lot to gain in doing services in different ways. So I thought, several of you do community engaged research, or what we call, grounded theory building, and very much involved. So engaging with community for many of you and many of us is the major goal for us. But service is also about building goodwill, especially as junior faculty. I went through all of this myself. I was asked to teach introduction to planning, land use planning, planning law. I'm just like, I laugh because, as a junior faculty, I was ready to pay my dues. But the same with service, especially institutional service, that you are building goodwill, because really is part of the tenure process is about whether any one of us is a good colleague and it really adds to the growth of the department or program or institution. So sometimes I do service really to build goodwill. And you will see some services are in that kind of direction. I also think service is about learning, and I can't tell you how much I've learned working in ACSP, various different roles. And I can't tell you how much I've learned actually being on the curriculum committee at VCU. My very first year, one of my colleagues say, I want to get you onto the curriculum committee. I was like, no. It's like so much work. But actually, I've learned so much. We did a overview of many comparable programs in their design of the Masters of City Planning curriculum. And it was such a learning process. I also learned how to propose a new course, what process it needs to go through, how to actually design a new concentration, or how to design even a new master's program, which I got involved later on at VCU. So it's actually really important. So one of my philosophies about doing service is that if I do the service, it has to be also making me learn. Like I can really gain another set of expertise and have a voice in decision making. That part is really important. So when I was at Tufts, some of my colleagues were telling me, our service load was very light, right? We don't have university senate, we didn't have faculty council at the college level. So there's just very little in the department level service. I was like, yeah, but, when you don't get involved in those places, you don't have a voice, right? And so eventually, actually, right after I left, not because of my work, but because a lot of faculty's work, that university set up a faculty senate and the college had a faculty council. And it is important to have voice in decision making, especially if none of us hopes to, become a dean or associate dean. In that sense, you become management, right? And you want a voice. And last but not least, actually, for myself, one of my narratives about service is really to integrate with my research. So I've done quite a bit professional service in terms of editorial responsibilities, in terms of reviewing grants applications. Now I sit on the panel. I also sat on the panel at NSF. It's a lot to do with what I do in my research. And you'll find that is very, very rewarding. And you actually build, you build your own network and build your community of scholars. You get to know lots of people who do work in your areas. And you get to know also how to pursue different opportunities. So in a way, service actually can be much, much more encompassing in a way of giving you opportunities to move forward in your own career. So I actually do not see service as service, quote unquote. I think it's actually a great set of opportunities. Although sometimes, yes, it involves a lot of hours, and I have happened to have this habit of never say no to, especially when people twist my arms. Can you serve on this committee? Can you serve on this panel? I have actually never said no to anything. And I remember listening in to, when I was a junior faculty, listening to Wim. I believe some of you may know about him. He was the president of Portland State University. He started as a planning faculty, became a dean, became a provost, and became a president. So he said something at administrators conference many years ago, said, I just never said no to anything. That had kind of stayed with me. I just never said no to anything. So that was, that's how I see service. And I think when you have emotional undertone that sees service as something that could add value, could add to your expertise, could add to your building of communities, and then you see service in a much more positive light, and then you build your narrative to show that, right? So next is, all of you are at various stages of your tenure career or your academic career in the tenure process, that how do you build your narrative in not only what you do or you choose to do, but also on paper when you go up either for first year review, third year review, or for your tenure review, right? Every institution has different landmarks in that process, but in each one of them, pretty much you have to talk about your service. And in some institutions, it may not be called service. So I think just like teaching or research, you want to show what your philosophy is, right? Why do you get engaged in service at all? I think for me, at the very beginning, when I was going up for third year review and tenure at VCU, which I'll show you the statement, I think I positioned quite centrally is how I use my expertise to serve the large community, and particularly the profession. I had a number of consultant projects. I also had a number of professional service kind of responsibilities. And so that was my central core. It wasn't as much as contributing to the institutional governance, because I was still junior faculty and my department was very kind in terms of trying to protect my time. So my involvement in the institutional governance was somewhat limited, even though it was at all different levels, but it was somewhat limited. And I also feel, and I think one of your questions on the Google Sheet also asked about how you actually show your impact, right? And can you identify the more high impact service activities first? Absolutely. I think you want to show in your narrative the scope, but also your contribution. And just like in research and teaching, the narrative should not just be about what activities you have been engaged in, but more importantly is about what impact you have achieved. The impact can be measured in different ways, right? For instance, in the curriculum committee I served, we were able to revise the department curriculum, reduce the number of required courses so that students have more flexibility. We were able to add new electives. Those are impact, really is, because students benefited from it, right? And then your professional service, you can also discuss your impact. And so years ago, when I was ready to apply for academic jobs, one of my dissertation committee members told me one thing that also stayed with me. That is, you don't have to repeat what's already in your CV. So in your narrative, you want to give people more or better sense of why you did this, how you did this, and what it actually achieved, instead of just say, oh, I serve on this committee, I serve on that committee, because it's all in your CV. People can see it, right? So you want to use that precious space you are allocated to or allotted to really talk about others. So impact and your contribution. And then some of you also mentioned in the question of how do you show if you're doing community engaged research, right? Can you talk about it in research? Can you talk about it in service? How do you actually, sort of put them in different parts of your statement? I would say a little bit the opposite, or I encourage you to try to really identify the synergy between your research and service. or synergy between your research and service, or synergy between your teaching and service, or synergy between your research and teaching, right? So, all these different combinations of three areas. So for example, again, curriculum development is service, but it's also teaching. I assume in many of your institutions, that's considered teaching. It's beyond classroom teaching, right? Of course, sometimes some universities won't count that as teaching if it's just serving on a curriculum committee. But if you have proposed a new course, or you propose a new concentration, you propose a new program, that is both teaching and service. And so I would encourage you to really actually identify that kind of synergy. Of course, the synergy may not be across your research areas, right? It may be in one particular research direction that you engage with community, both in terms of research as well as providing your expertise to the communities through either volunteer work or even paid work. So that synergy needs to be more specific, and the more you can identify the impact and the scope, and the more convincing it becomes. And then I think there's one question about how do you show your professional growth in service, right? And that is also kind of similar to research. And so when I was at VCU, one of the things that the university was looking for in terms of a candidate's readiness for tenure is this following sentence, that the candidate is building or has already built a national reputation in his or her or their research expertise area, right? Actually, you would think every university asks for that, right? No, actually, it's really interesting. At Tufts and similarly at Columbia, that criterion is much more porous. We actually don't say that so clearly. And in fact, at Tufts, they use this very kind of interesting phrase called quality of the mind. We were just like, whatever that is, right? So, some of the criteria can be quite, elusive and porous. But I actually really value the way that VCU did this. So for someone to then go up from junior faculty from assistant professor after they tenured to become associate professor, then from associate professor to full professor, what they are looking for is an international reputation. So that kind of goes from national to international, right? So that's for research. I think you can do the same way with the research service, right? So you can move from departmental service in terms of institutional service, right? From departmental to college to university. And then in Virginia, there's also a state council for higher education that they sometimes ask faculty to serve on. And so, you moved, in terms of institutional channels from a smaller scope to a medium and to larger and higher scope. I hate to say higher, just larger scope. And then in terms of your professional service, right, you can start from a regional group or from a committee in a national group to, say, governing board or even holding office as either regional rep in terms of ACSP or other kinds of elected office. Or in terms of editorial services, you can move from being a reviewer. So don't underestimate the importance of being a reviewer, because that's how the whole peer review process works. Without the peer reviewers, it collapses, right? So you are doing service by being a peer reviewer, but then you potentially, along the way, you become a editorial board member, or you become associate editor, a regional editor, and then you assume editorial responsibilities. And that's growth, right? And then should be demonstrated in the same way as you will talk about your teaching, how your teaching evaluations have improved. You've taken on new courses, you've taken on beyond the classroom teaching, and the same with your research, right? Where you publish and, how they have evolved. So I think you can do the same with service, that how your contribution and the scope of your contribution have evolved. Oops, let me see. I think that's the last part of how you build your narrative. And the last part is, how do you put all of that, right? Your thinking, your work, your activities all on paper. For me, when I was going up for tenure, I think professional service was like my highlight. So I think I put it first, but it doesn't really matter, actually. It really doesn't matter where you put it, or first or second or third. The contents will show, right? Some institution may mandate you go through a certain kinds of order, and that's okay. Your content will shine through. So for professional service, I think you'll want to think about, review, service to professional organizations and societies, editorial responsibilities, grant agencies, all of that, and then others that I may not have served, but you should put in there. And then public outreach is really, in some institutions, called community service, but sometimes it's beyond community service, because it could also involve advisory responsibilities for organizations that are in your large community, right? Redevelopment authority, or a nonprofit organization that you sit on the board. I guess you could call that community engagement, but in some ways it's in a slightly different nature of work. And last but not least is institutional governance, right? Committees, task forces, student advising. I don't know, student advising in different universities may be defined differently, may fit in a different category, but generally that should go into service, although sometimes it could be considered as teaching, right? Because beyond classroom teaching. Curriculum development, I always considered as really a service, but also teaching, right? So it's synergy. And for me, it was synergy with teaching, but a colleague of mine at VCU really kind of, so VCU's planning department was one of the first planning departments that started doing outcome assessment, learning outcome assessment, way before, PAB required it. So this colleague actually pioneered a lot of the efforts, and he ended up publishing on how you do outcome assessment, what it tells you, and sort of the know-hows of doing learning outcome assessment. So it became research, and also teaching, and also service, and that's perfect when you have one activity that really kind of qualifies for all three areas. It's pretty hard, but you can do it, and just kind of keep that in mind. So those are the sort of the structure I would kind of share with you of how I, organize the service and think about service and present about service. Of course, again, let me say it, it's hindsight is always 2020. I'm not sure I thought any of this in this way when I was going through tenure, at least the first time. So don't think like I really thought about all of this back then. So what I want to do now is to share, can you see this Word document?
No, the PowerPoint
No.
still.
Okay, so I gotta reshare, I guess, right?
Yeah.
There. Can you see now?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think when you do the share on Zoom, only when you do a web browser, you switch in between tabs, that you don't have to reshare. But it's a different software, you can't do it apparently. So it's weird. Anyway, so this was my VCU statement. I guess it was 2001, something like that. And so I had a upfront, like almost executive summary called, it was just called narrative. But I had like a quick summary. So the first point was research. Second point was teaching. Third point was my service in a very summary fashion. And you notice I didn't list everything. I just highlighted like the really important ones. And I had a fourth point, which is synergy. I really felt it was important to highlight that why I did what I did and what was driving my kind of consideration at the time to take up these activities. I did some, consulting for the World Bank. I also, got involved with HUD very briefly, got involved with ACSP very briefly. So you notice I didn't say anything about institutional governance that much at the out front, right, at the summary level. So if you come with me to my actual section of service statement, I think it was roughly 3 pages long. I can't remember. You will see all of it. I think it's 3 pages. And can you see well enough, or should I enlarge it a little bit more?
I can see.
You can see, okay. Because sometimes, with Zoom, with a laptop, you might not be able to see well, but just holler if you can. It's not clear enough. So you can see that I have a very short narrative why I do my service in terms of particularly professional service. So I did put my professional service at the upfront because I thought that was most unique for me and also probably the most, in terms of impact, most obvious. And I do a lot of work on urban China. I do a lot of work on issues related to migration and housing. And you will see that those themes also come through in my service statement, especially my involvement with this virtual research network, which actually it was a lot of work. We had to review student research proposals. We had to mentor students. So it was quite a bit of work. So I wanted to highlight that. And then my service with the larger community, again, involved a lot about my own expertise, my work on international related issues, on China. So that's that. And the last bit of it was institutional governance. So so with institutional governance, you will see my CV also in a little bit. That I organize it at the university level, at the college level, and then at the department level, right? So I talked about the university level first. I was involved with a couple of centers, and then at the department level was primarily curriculum committee. And so I actually talked about how we worked on the curriculum and contributed significantly to the graduate curriculum revision that occurred during whatever time. And then I was the one who kind of organized this very informal brown bag lunch research series. I mean, that's not committee, but that's service, right? Because I had to make a lot of calls to invite other colleagues from other universities to come, and I kind of organized. So that's service. So it doesn't have to be just committee, but what you have done to your institution really resulted in the service contribution you should put in there. I was wrong. It was not 3 pages. It was 2 pages, but it was single space, right? So then I conclude. And so that was my statement. I think my total statement length was less than 10 pages. So it was not very long. So service was 2 pages. So that's pretty sizable, right, content. So I wanted to show you quickly, like in terms of in my CV, how I organized when I was at VCU for the tenure application in terms of service, right? So I had professional service and about 5 different things. And that was actually, interestingly, my start of getting engaged with ACSP was, again, in the international group because my research was such, and then I got to build, a community of scholars, got to know other people. It kind of snowballed from there. And then community service. And then you notice here, I did cross-list. So my consultant for the World Bank, I cross-list under book chapters, right? So my colleagues always told me it's okay to double count, but you always make it very clear, like you are listing it in whichever other section. So you want to be really clear so that people don't get the impression that you're trying to, beef up your CV, right? And then my other consultant work for the World Bank cross-listed under professional reports. And then institutional service, in the same way that I listed or I described in my statement, from university to department. My institution always required us to put the committee chair name in the CV because they actually reached out to these chair persons to get a statement or to verify. And part of doing that is also, so when you organize your statement or your CV, you want to make it easier for your colleagues to follow up, right? So you always keep good records and who actually, the length of your service, who was chair, and so on. It's always a good thing to good, sort of practice. So when I went up, well, I couldn't call it a went up. When I changed institution from Tufts to Columbia, I had to go through tenure again. It was a lateral move, so I went through tenure at a full professor level. And you will see, I think it's actually a shorter statement on service. It was a very quick summary of my service, both particularly beyond institutional service. I hardly mentioned much at all in terms of institutional service, because that's like at Columbia, it's assumed you're going to do that, and it doesn't make you stand out in any way. So I was being hired to become a program director, so I needed to highlight leadership roles that are assumed in service, right? So I would highlight, my ACSP leadership role, my editorial leadership role, and then I actually had to tell them about impact, right? What I did at the journal and how, as one indicator, not a lot of them, how it has, changed under my editorialship. I talked about my consulting work with various different international organizations and network. I did talk about my within institutional work at Tufts, but it was more about building connections with another school at Tufts, the Fletcher School, which was sort of very interdisciplinary. So that is because Columbia was looking for that and was really looking for me to build that kind of relationship as I came to Columbia. So that was important for me to highlight. And so that was it. I'm sorry, it was not even a page. It was like, it wasn't even 2 pages. It was just 1 page in a statement that, again, was about 10 pages. And so you see it's much, much shorter. And I didn't highlight that much of what I would do, but because that statement, at the end, what I highlight more, what I will do is more in my research and being a program director, right? So it wasn't in the service section. And so, but if you look at the CV, my service has really expanded and it becomes much, much longer. So because I had been in different universities, so I organized them by different universities. So if you look, so I actually put university service first for this CV. So at Tufts, at VCU, it got crazy. VCU has such a long list, it was just a little bit crazy. And then service to discipline. So I separated different types of service for discipline. So the first block is more what we call editorial services, right? And then, editorial services also included the grants review and all the manuscript reviews I did for various different journals. It just became kind of ridiculous. I'm starting to say no now. And then because I've done a lot for ACSP, so I listed ACSP separately, the various different activities I've done, and then others in terms of professional services, and then public outreach. That is the part that didn't grow as much over time. I just simply took up more institutional service roles as well as professional service roles in terms of public outreach. It didn't grow very much. And so that you see is still very much the sort of same length as my initial package. Let me stop sharing and open up to questions or